The United States government will spend approximately $1 trillion this year on interest payments for money it has already borrowed. Not on schools, not on roads, not on healthcare. Just interest. Money that buys nothing, builds nothing, and helps no one. To put that in perspective, the entire U.S. military budget, the largest in the world, is around $850 billion. That includes every aircraft carrier, every fighter jet, every soldier's salary, every military base across the globe. The interest on our debt now costs more than our entire defense apparatus. Here's another way to think about it. If you stacked $1 trillion in $100 bills, the pile would reach 631 miles high. You could build that stack from New York to Chicago and back. Every year, that's how much money vanishes into interest payments before the government can spend a single dollar on anything else. The national debt stands at $38 trillion. That's $38,000 billion. The number is so large it stops having meaning. So let me break it down. Every American citizen, from newborns to retirees, owes roughly $115,000 as their share of the national debt. A family of four owes nearly $500,000 before they've bought their first house or taken out their first student loan. And it's accelerating. The government is currently running annual deficits of $1.5 to $2 trillion, meaning the debt grows by that amount every single year. At current trajectories, by 2030, interest payments alone could exceed $1.4 trillion annually, more than Social Security. This is the money timeline. Today, we're going to walk through how America accumulated this debt, why the interest trap is tightening, and what happens when a superpower can't pay its bills. Let's rewind to the year 2000. The U.S. national debt was about $5.7 trillion. That sounds like a lot, but it was roughly 55% of GDP. Manageable. The budget was actually balanced. The government was taking in more than it spent. There was serious talk about paying off the entire national debt within 10 to 15 years. Then everything changed. The year 2001 brought two massive shocks. First, the dot-com bubble burst, cratering tax revenues as stock market wealth evaporated. Then came September 11th. The political calculus shifted overnight. Suddenly, fiscal restraint seemed unpatriotic. We had wars to fight, a homeland to secure, and an economy to stimulate. Enter the tax cuts. In 2001 and 2003, the Bush administration pushed through massive tax reductions, arguing they would pay for themselves through economic growth. They didn't. Federal revenues dropped from about 20% of GDP to 17%, and they never fully recovered. Then came the wars. Afghanistan and Iraq. Not small peacekeeping operations, full-scale invasions, and decades-long occupations. Here's the thing about these wars. Congress didn't pay for them. Previous American wars were funded through tax increases or war bonds. Vietnam, Korea, World War II, citizens were asked to sacrifice. But the war on terror went on the credit card. Estimates suggest the total cost of the post-9/11 wars topped $6 trillion when you include long-term veteran care and interest on borrowed money. By the time 2008 rolled around, the debt had grown to about $10 trillion, still theoretically manageable. Then the financial system imploded. The 2008 financial crisis required immediate, massive government intervention. Bank bailouts, auto industry rescues, stimulus packages, extended unemployment benefits. The government essentially became the buyer and lender of last resort for the entire economy. The intervention added trillions to the debt. Throughout the 2010s, both parties talked about fiscal responsibility while doing nothing about it. Republicans would rail against spending when Democrats controlled Congress, then explode the deficit with tax cuts when they were in power. Democrats would criticize tax cuts for the wealthy, then oppose any meaningful reform to entitlement programs when they held the reins. The pattern was clear. When times were bad, deficit spending was necessary to save the economy. When times were good, deficit spending was fine because the economy was strong and could handle it. There was never a right time to actually pay down debt. By 2020, the national debt had reached $27 trillion, about 100% of GDP. 2 decades of tax cuts, wars, bailouts, and stimulus programs without any serious effort to pay for them. The credit card was maxed out. And then COVID hit. If the previous 2 decades were bad, 2020 and 2021 were catastrophic for the national debt. When the pandemic shut down the global economy, the U.S. government opened the floodgates, multiple rounds of stimulus checks sent directly to households, the Paycheck Protection Program handing out forgivable loans to businesses, expanded unemployment benefits, rent and mortgage payment freezes, student loan payment pauses, state and local government bailouts, vaccine development funding. In 2 years, the federal government spent roughly $5 trillion on COVID-related programs. Let me put that in perspective. That's more than the entire cost of World War II in inflation-adjusted dollars. In 2 years, we added as much debt as it took to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Some of the spending was clearly necessary. When you shut down the economy, you can't just let people starve in the streets, but a lot of the money didn't go where it was supposed to. The Paycheck Protection Program was riddled with fraud. Estimates suggest anywhere from $80 billion to $200 billion was stolen or misallocated. Fake companies, fraudulent applications, business owners who took the money and bought Lamborghinis instead of keeping workers employed. The stimulus checks went to everyone, including people who never lost their jobs and didn't need the money. Millionaires got stimulus checks. Dead people got stimulus checks. There was zero means testing for most of it. And here's the kicker. Much of that money didn't stay in the U.S. economy. People used stimulus checks to buy electronics made in China, furniture made in Vietnam, and clothes made in Bangladesh. We borrowed trillions from future generations to stimulate other countries' economies. By the end of 2021, the national debt had exploded to over $30 trillion. We added nearly $6 trillion in debt in less than 2 years. The ratio of debt to GDP shot past 125%, but the real damage wasn't just the amount we borrowed. It was what we lost in the process. Any remaining political will to control spending evaporated. If we could print trillions during COVID without the economy collapsing, the logic went, why couldn't we do it again for climate change? Infrastructure, student loan forgiveness, or whatever cause seems urgent next. The COVID spending broke something fundamental in American fiscal psychology. It proved that the government could spend essentially unlimited amounts of money without immediate consequences. The bill wouldn't come due today or tomorrow. It would be a future problem. Well, the future is now. The real crisis isn't just the size of the debt. It's the cost of servicing it. For years, the U.S. government got away with massive debt because interest rates were historically low. In the 2010s, the government could borrow money for practically nothing. 10-year Treasury bonds yielded around 2%. Some shorter-term bonds even had negative real yields after accounting for inflation. It was essentially free money. Politicians on both sides loved this. They could spend whatever they wanted, and the interest costs were manageable. In 2020, the government spent about $345 billion on interest payments. That's a lot of money, but it was less than the defense budget and less than what we spent on various social programs. Then came inflation. Massive stimulus spending combined with supply chain disruptions and energy price spikes sent inflation to levels not seen since the 1980s. The Federal Reserve had no choice but to raise interest rates aggressively to combat it. Here's the problem with debt. When interest rates go up, the cost of servicing that debt explodes, and the U.S. has to constantly refinance maturing bonds. Old bonds paying 2% are replaced with new bonds paying 4 or 5%. By 2024, interest payments on the national debt hit $880 billion. By 2025, they're approaching $1 trillion. Let me give you some context for how insane that is. The entire defense budget, the largest military in the world, all the aircraft carriers, fighter jets, submarines, and soldier salaries is around $850 billion. We're now spending more on interest, money that buys absolutely nothing, than we spend on national defense. Interest payments are about to become the single largest line item in the federal budget. Not Social Security, not Medicare, not defense. Interest on money we've already spent. And here's the truly vicious part. This is a doom loop. Higher interest costs mean larger deficits. Larger deficits mean more borrowing. More borrowing means even higher interest costs in the future. It's a compounding disaster. By 2030, projections suggest interest costs could exceed $1.4 trillion annually. That's more than we spend on all of Social Security. We'll be spending more to service old debt than we spend on the entire retirement system for 70 million Americans. Think about what that means. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar that can't be spent on infrastructure, education, research, or defense. It's a dollar that's just gone, transferred to bondholders, many of whom are foreign governments and investors. We're not investing in the future anymore. We're paying for the past, and the bill is getting bigger every single day. Now let's talk about the part of the budget that politicians won't touch. Social Security and Medicare. These two programs make up roughly 40% of all federal spending. They're the sacred cows of American politics. Suggest any reform, any cut, any change to the eligibility age or benefits formula, and you commit political suicide. The AARP will mobilize millions of voters against you. Your opponent will run ads showing you pushing grandma off a cliff. So nobody touches them. But they're going broke. Social Security is projected to run out of money around 2033. When that happens, benefits will automatically be cut by about 25%, unless Congress acts. Imagine being a retiree living on $2,000 a month in Social Security, barely scraping by, and suddenly your check drops to $1,500. That's the reality facing millions of Americans in less than a decade. Medicare is in even worse shape. It's projected to be insolvent by 2031. Healthcare costs are rising faster than general inflation. An aging population means more people drawing benefits while fewer workers pay into the system. The math simply doesn't work. Here's why this is a national debt crisis, not just an entitlement crisis. When Social Security and Medicare run out of money, Congress will have to bail them out. They'll have to increase funding from general revenues, which means borrowing more money, adding to the national debt. The demographic reality is brutal. In 1950, there were 16 workers paying into Social Security for every retiree drawing benefits. Today, that ratio is less than 3 to 1. By 2035, it'll be closer to 2 to 1. You cannot run a sustainable system when two workers have to support one retiree, especially when that retiree might live another 20 or 30 years. Reforming these programs is politically toxic but mathematically necessary. You could raise the retirement age. You could means test benefits so wealthy retirees get less. You could increase the payroll tax cap. You could adjust the cost of living formula. But none of this happens because no politician wants to be the one who cut Social Security. So instead, we pretend the problem doesn't exist until it becomes a crisis. And when that crisis hits, the solution will be emergency borrowing, adding trillions more to the national debt. Here's the core problem. Everyone in Washington knows the debt is unsustainable. The Congressional Budget Office puts out reports every year showing the disaster approaching. Economists across the political spectrum agree this can't continue. Even most politicians in private will admit we're heading for a cliff. But nothing changes because the solutions are political poison. You have three options: cut spending, raise taxes, or some combination of both. All three are deeply unpopular. Cutting spending sounds simple until you look at what you'd actually cut. Defense spending makes you appear weak on national security. Social Security and Medicare reforms lose you every voter over 55. Infrastructure cuts mean collapsed bridges during election season. Education cuts are painted as anti-American. Foreign aid is less than 1% of the budget. Cutting it completely barely makes a dent. The reality is that about 70% of federal spending is mandatory, or effectively untouchable. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt, and defense make up the vast majority of the budget. The discretionary spending everyone argues about is only about 30%. And much of that is things like veterans benefits, the FBI, federal courts, things you can't really cut without serious consequences. Raising taxes is equally toxic. Republicans have signed pledges to never raise taxes under any circumstances. Many Democrats resist tax increases on the middle class, which is where the real money is. You can tax billionaires at 100% and it wouldn't solve the problem. There aren't enough of them and they just leave. The harsh math is this: to actually balance the budget without cutting major programs, you'd need to raise taxes on everyone, middle class included, by probably 20 to 30%. That means paychecks suddenly becoming 25% smaller. That's not a winning campaign platform. So what happens instead is theater. Politicians agree to symbolic spending caps that get waived whenever it's convenient. They pass temporary measures that kick the problem down the road. They have dramatic debt ceiling fights that accomplish nothing except threatening the country's credit rating. Every few years, there's a bipartisan commission that produces a thoughtful plan with reasonable compromises. The Simpson-Bowles Commission in 2010 is a perfect example. It was ignored completely because implementing it would have required politicians to do unpopular things. The incentive structure is broken. Politicians operate on 2-year and 6-year election cycles. The debt crisis will explode 10, 20, 30 years from now. There's no political reason to sacrifice your career today to solve a problem that will be someone else's mess tomorrow. And every time there's a crisis, economic downturn, pandemic, or war, the deficit explodes because emergency spending is always justified. But when the economy is good, nobody wants to run surpluses to pay down debt. They want to cut taxes or increase spending on popular programs. So the debt only goes one direction, up. There are several ways this could play out, and none of them are pleasant. Scenario 1, the slow grind. This is the most likely outcome. No dramatic collapse, just a steady erosion of American living standards. The government keeps borrowing, interest costs keep rising, and there's less and less money for everything else. Infrastructure crumbles. Schools deteriorate. Medical care gets more expensive and less accessible. The military loses its technological edge because there's no money for research and development. America doesn't collapse overnight. It just slowly becomes a less prosperous, less powerful version of itself. Think Britain after World War II. Still a player, but no longer the superpower. Scenario 2, the inflation escape. The government decides it can't actually pay back the debt in real terms, so it inflates its way out. The Federal Reserve keeps interest rates artificially low, prints money to buy government bonds, and lets inflation run hot for years. This erodes the real value of the debt. If you owe $30 trillion and you let inflation run at 6 or 7% for a decade, that debt becomes much less burdensome. The problem? Inflation destroys savings, crushes the middle class, and creates massive social unrest. Retirees on fixed incomes get wiped out. Anyone holding cash or bonds gets destroyed. It's a hidden default, and it hurts ordinary people the most. Scenario 3, the crisis default. This is the nightmare scenario. At some point, the bond market loses confidence in U.S. debt. Maybe it's because of political dysfunction, maybe a failed debt ceiling negotiation, maybe just the math finally catching up. Interest rates spike. The government can't roll over maturing debt at affordable rates. The Treasury starts missing payments. Global financial markets panic. The dollar collapses as the world reserve currency. Retirement accounts evaporate. Banks fail. It's 2008 times 10. The scary thing about this scenario? It can happen very suddenly. One day everything is fine, and the next day there's a run on Treasury bonds, and the whole system seizes up. Argentina, Greece, and Lebanon have all experienced this. It seemed impossible until the day it wasn't. Scenario 4, the authoritarian response. When democracies face severe economic stress, they sometimes take dark turns. A government facing fiscal collapse might resort to capital controls, asset seizures, forced retirement account conversions to government bonds, or wealth taxes that are effectively confiscation. History is full of examples of governments that, faced with insolvency, turned authoritarian to maintain control. None of these scenarios are good. The best case is a slow decline in American prosperity. The worst case is societal collapse and the end of democratic governance. There are theoretical ways to avoid disaster, but the practical obstacles are enormous. Option 1, miraculous economic growth. If the U.S. economy suddenly started growing at 4 or 5% annually for a sustained period, tax revenues would surge, and the debt-to-GDP ratio would improve without cuts or tax hikes. This is what happened after World War II. The debt was huge, but decades of strong growth made it manageable. The problem? There's no sign of that kind of growth appearing. Productivity is stagnating. The population is aging. The low-hanging fruit of globalization has been picked. Option 2, a grand bargain. Republicans and Democrats come together, agree to a combination of spending cuts and tax increases, and implement a long-term plan to stabilize the debt. It would require both parties to accept things they hate. Republicans would have to accept tax increases. Democrats would have to accept entitlement reform. Moderates from both sides would have to ignore their party's extremes and do what's necessary. In theory, it's possible. In practice, the current political environment makes this fantasy. Option 3, austerity. The government implements severe spending cuts, reduces the deficit dramatically, and starts paying down debt. This is what some European countries tried in the 2010s. The results were mixed at best. Severe austerity usually triggers a recession, which lowers tax revenues, which makes the debt problem worse. It's politically brutal and economically painful. Option 4, default and restructure. The U.S. could do what other heavily indebted countries have done. Stop paying some of its debts, negotiate with creditors, and restructure the debt at reduced amounts. This would destroy the dollar's status as the global reserve currency, but it would reduce the debt burden. The economic damage would be catastrophic in the short term, but the country might emerge stronger in the long run without crushing debt. No U.S. politician will publicly suggest this, but don't think it hasn't been discussed in private. The reality is that none of these options will be chosen willingly. What will likely happen is crisis-driven reform. The government will stumble along, doing nothing, until there's a market panic or a political crisis that forces action. And at that point, the choices will be much more limited and much more painful than if we'd acted earlier. The United States has $38 trillion in debt and counting. Interest payments are consuming the budget. Entitlement programs are going insolvent. Politicians won't cut spending or raise taxes. And the can has been kicked down the road for so long that we're running out of road. The money timeline on this issue is stark. We went from a balanced budget in 2000 to an unsustainable debt spiral in just 25 years. Tax cuts without spending cuts. Wars without sacrifice. Bailouts without reform. And finally, a pandemic that broke whatever fiscal discipline remained. The lesson is simple but painful. You can't borrow forever. Eventually, the bill comes due, and when it does, your choices are between bad and worse. Thanks for watching The Money Timeline.